Chapter 13 of the American Government class is talking about economic policy, and there's quite a bit to talk about with this, so I wanted to break it down into two lectures. So let's talk a little bit about the economy in general, and then the next time we'll talk about a little bit more on economic policy. As you recall, one of the very first classes that we had, we talked about the purpose of government was to maintain law and order and protect our property rights and our individual liberties as one of them as well. In addition, we talked about providing public goods and services that the market itself may not be able to provide. And two of these things involving the economy. So the government sets up the framework for our economy, as we'll see, and then monitors it, support the economy to try to make sure that it's working at its maximum efficiency. So let's talk a little bit about capitalism, the system in which our economy has evolved into. Capitalism, broad definition, is that the ownership and the means of production are maintained by individuals or corporations. Capital being the key word. Capital is any type of assets or wealth, property, those things like that. Capitalism driven by the pursuit of income, wealth, and profit, maximizing your revenue. It's driven by a market system where prices are influenced by supply and demand, competition, flow of information. In a ideal situation, you have our demand of consumers that will buy products at a certain price. It's an inverse relationship because as the price goes up, we're typically going to buy less of it. The suppliers are creating the products and producing that at a price. Obviously, as the demand goes up, suppliers want to make more of it. So what happens is you meet here, the two curves meet into what is called an equilibrium price that the buyers and sellers generally agreed upon. Capitalism works on a continuous cycle. Product market measured by the GDP, income market measured by the GNI. This is gross domestic product. This is gross national income. So it's probably a good idea just to take a couple of minutes and talk about how that works. What we have in our society is all the households. That's what HH stands for. We also have the firms, and then the government pretty much right in the middle of everything. So what we have is a cycle that works in both directions, from households to firms back around. First thing we can look at here is the firms are providing the products and the goods and the services for us who live in our households. So what do the households provide back to the firms for those products and goods? Well, they provide the consumption. Capital C, consumption, that is the biggest portion of our gross domestic product, is how much we buy. We also invest in the firms. This typically goes through the banks. We put our money in the bank, and the bank loans money to the firms for them to add more capital equipment, add more people, provide more products. G is for the government expense. So the government is spending money to do what it needs to do. So it's part of this cycle, and this is the net exports. Now, since we have a trade deficit where we have more imports than we have exports, this portion of it here has always been in the negative over the past few decades. So on this half of the cycle, firms providing products and services and goods to the household providing the consumption and the investment back to them. This is the gross domestic product side of our cycle. But it keeps going. It's going around in circles in opposite directions, as we said. So let's look at the bottom half down here. The households are providing their labor and their land and their entrepreneurialism. They are providing that to the firms. So what do the firms provide back to the households? Well, they are providing the wages. That's what the W stands for. They're providing the wages. They're also paying interest on this investment that goes back to the households. They're also paying the rents on the land that we are providing the firms for them to be able to lease to. And then the profit. The firms make a profit. Now, they can do lots of things with that profit, but one of the things they can do is give it back to the people in the households that are owning and running and working at these firms. So the bottom half of this cycle is what we call the gross national income side of this market product cycle. And generally, the gross domestic product is approximately equal to the gross national income. Now, looking here in the middle, the government at the center of everything, the households are paying taxes back to the government, primarily in the form of income taxes, but the government also provides transfer payments back to the households. Transfer payments in the form of things such as Medicare, Social Security, unemployment, things like that. On the other side of the government over here, we have the business firms, corporations, paying corporate taxes back to the government. Government also provides transfer payments back to the firms. These are in the forms of things like subsidies, which is grants in order for firms to be able to compete with foreign companies, tax breaks, things like that. So this is the cycle of our capitalist system here. So that gives you a little bit of an overview, some of these terms. Adam Smith, who in Wealth of Nations is considered pretty much the father of the modern market system, talking about the invisible hand, guides individuals, benefits society through the pursuit of their private interests. So what he's saying is the invisible hand is our, you could perhaps call it greed, but or at least our desire for profit, and competition keeps us in check so that we will produce something for society at a reasonable price. So it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker that we expect our dinner, but it's from their regard to their own self-interest. So what we're doing here is channeling our self-interest into a good for the entire society by making products that we want. But there's lots of complications to capitalism. We'll touch on a few here. Capitalism has a tendency towards monopolistic, where one firm controls pretty much everything in that sector, or oligopolistic tendencies, where only a handful of firms are controlling that sector of the market, and that's pretty much what we have. When you look at any particular sector of the market, whether it's communications systems or airlines, even mattress companies or pharmacies, you see that there's only a handful of firms that are dominating the vast majority of that market. And that's just kind of a tendency of how it goes. When firms get bigger, they want to get even bigger because there's more advantages out there, what we call on the margins. It costs them less and less and less to make that one additional product as the bigger they get with more productive capacity. So therefore, they can literally just put other companies out of business, or if they get big enough, they can do other things. Facebook is an example there, where Instagram was an up-and-coming young firm. Facebook perhaps could have outcompeted them because at that time they had 800 million pairs of eyeballs looking at their site, and they could have perhaps copied or duplicated the algorithm that Instagram had and then just outcompeted them and took away their market. But what they did instead is just bought them out. They bought Instagram, which had a grand total of 12 employees. They bought them out for $1 billion. And they did that because they could. Now, monopolies can have negative effects to the economy. That's why a government is tasked with keeping an eye on them, because a monopoly could potentially start raising prices because there's no competition, or they could also start making their products with less quality because there's no competition. So they could literally do what they wanted to if we still needed to buy that product. Another thing that capitalism has a tendency of is these boom and bust cycles. Right now, because of the coronavirus pandemic, has put people a lot back at home, so our consumption has dropped dramatically, and that puts a kink in the entire cycle that we just looked at. And then people are losing their jobs, and so the economy could go into recession, may already be in a recession. But that's even without this particular crisis that we're in. This is a fairly natural thing that occurs every now and then. We had a recession in 2001 because of the dot-com bubble. There was too much of a supply of dot-com websites that was outracing the demand. We also saw the housing bubble with the subprime mortgage loans that got out of hand, and that came back and blew up in our face and created the Great Recession, 2008, 2009. So this is another thing that we've got to keep an eye on, because human behavior does not really guard against that. Human behavior says, oh, this is working really good. Let's ride this gravy train because we're making money. And we just ride it until we ride it into a ditch, and then the thing collapses on us. Another thing that capitalism has to deal with is inequality. Not only is inequality a byproduct of capitalism, in most human societies, there's inequality that's going to be inevitable. But capitalism tends to actually thrive on inequality, because it's that inequality that causes people to look for those opportunities to move up and perhaps better themselves in life, improve their standards of living by using the market system to do that. But because it's not a perfect system, it's not a completely equal opportunity structure, as we would get into in a lot more detail in other classes, then it has a tendency to accumulate wealth at the top. That's another thing that we've got to watch out for. Also, the question of how much to regulate, or do we need to deregulate? If something gets out of hand, we might need to regulate it to prevent it from happening again. But if the economy's booming and going pretty well, then an administration might want to deregulate, because regulations may be slowing down the economy. So this is a constant dilemma. Whether to regulate or deregulate tends to run a little bit along party lines, but depending on what happens out there in the world, then that could change overnight. Looking at some other aspects of capitalism that are getting attention, productivity in our system has been increasing at a rather steady rate because of technology and efficiency. But also at the same time, that has been leveling out the hourly compensation. So what we see is that while productivity keeps going up, our real wages have pretty much stagnated over the past few decades. So that has to do with things like outsourcing and technological efficiency and automation that's replacing people's jobs, and other factors that are conducive to corporations paying lower wages. So that's another thing that we have to look at. Also, because of the tendency towards accumulation of wealth at the top, we see that the top 1% has been having pretty substantial income gains in general over the same period of time. Whereas when you look at the bottom and the middle sectors there, not near as much of an increase by comparison. So that's another thing that we have to deal with, because there is a little bit of consensus that if inequality gets too high, and that the question is how high would that have to be before there'd be some consensus on that it's starting to get kind of dysfunctional to society. Here's an example, perhaps, of our new sharing economy. Here's how our economy's changed quite a bit. Back in 1962, the top 5 corporations in America in terms of market capitalization, you can see how many thousands of employees that they had, hundreds of thousands of employees. Now, as we move to the more digital-oriented technology, just as recently as 2012, the top companies in the United States had dramatically fewer employees than what the big companies did back in those days. So putting fewer people to work, that's another consequence of the changing economy. Walmart, which does put a lot of people to work, is an example of the new type of corporation that hires a lot of part-time people, does not let them join unions, and so therefore lower wages in general. One of the functions of government is to support the economy, promote the economy, try to assist the economy in doing what it needs to do to put more people to work. Because if more people are working, government looks better at the same time. So in order to set up that framework, government defines and protects the property rights for people to own property, buy and sell property, things like that. Laws of exchange, we have to have rules on how to exchange property, use of money. Enforcing contracts, we talked about civil law earlier. One of the parts of civil law was contract law. So if somebody makes a contract and one person breaks that, well then government has to get involved to make sure that that system is upheld. Determining what a monopoly is. We've already talked about the potential that monopolies could do, and we've had a lot of benefits to our economy by big, huge firms that started to become monopolistic, but at some point the government has to decide, are they stifling competition rather than helping? And with the case of Standard Oil is a good example. Controlled about 90% of the entire oil industry, from pumping it out of the ground to putting it into the kerosene lanterns. And when they decided to break that up, the amount of revenue that was spread out to all these new companies that were able to form from that was a tremendous boom to the economy. When you look at all the other new firms that would grow up and have kind of a synergistic effect of forming their own labor forces in their own products, things like that. So that's something that the governments still have to look at today when you consider that firms like Google and Facebook and Amazon are very much close to behaving like monopolies. Also, as to who can file bankruptcy, how fair is that for somebody to get into debt and then not have to pay it back? But the system was set up so that people, if they make mistakes or if they get into a bind that may not even be their own fault, they have a chance to recover from that. So that's another thing that our society decided to provide a framework for. Government also has to defer social costs. We've touched on social costs before, such as the social costs of alcohol. You know, what does consumption of alcohol, even though it's legal, what costs could that incur on society, which includes DWIs, which could result in death and damage and destruction, or domestic violence, or disorderly conduct, or long-term health problems. There's lots of things that alcohol has social costs involved, and those social costs are astronomically more than what the benefits that we get off of taxing alcohol. So that's something that we have to take a look at. Cigarettes is another example. Government has worked very diligently over the past several decades to pretty much weed out cigarette smoking dramatically less than what it was as recently as the 60s. Government also educates, regulates the labor force. Government is responsible for our public education. It's also part of our state-supported universities, things like that, so that we can have an educated workforce. It regulates the labor force so that we can assure that we have people that are qualified for safety reasons. There's licensing requirements that for most professions, government has to provide that. It also promotes and regulates competition. We've already talked about the monopolistic behavior, but even between states, perhaps, if one state feels like it's not able to compete against another state that's got a bigger population and a lot more resources, well, then they may actually lobby the federal government to help reduce those inconsistencies between states or to help their economy prosper. One thing that the government does in its policies is to instill confidence, shore up confidence. If things aren't going very well, the federal government is considered the lender of last resort, and its stability is vital to providing the foundation to our economic system. While economic institutions are critical for determining whether a country is poor or prosperous, it is politics and political institutions that determine what economic institutions a country has. So let's talk about monetary policy for the remainder of this lecture, and then for part 2, we'll talk about fiscal policy and the other techniques of policy that the government uses. Monetary policy is regulating the flow of money out there in the system, and the Federal Reserve has the responsibility for doing that. We'll talk about just very generally what their basic functions are, but the Federal Reserve System is the national system of banks. All the private banks in the United States that are called national banks are members of the Federal Reserve System. There's 12 major locations. We'll look at the map here in a minute with 25 branches of the Federal Reserve, the bank of the banks. So the Federal Reserve's customers are all of these private banks out there in the United States. There's 7 on the Board of Governors at one time. They're all appointed by the President for overlapping 14-year terms. The chair is appointed for a 4-year term, Jerome Powell, current chairman. The Federal Reserve is set up to be somewhat autonomous and independent. We want the central bank's policies to be separate from politics. They have to focus on the economics, and we'll see that whenever there's an economic crisis, the party ideologies just fly out the window, and they're going, well, what do we need to do to save the economy or to support the economy? That was quite evident in the 2001 and the 2008 financial crises, when administrations did some very drastic measures that their party probably wouldn't have wanted to do under normal conditions. So the central bank has to be focusing on what do we need to do. And inflation could be potentially more destructive to economies than unemployment, and that's why the central banks have been fairly successful over the last few decades focusing on inflation to keep that at a relatively low level, even though there is perhaps a trade-off with unemployment. Politicians would be less willing to undertake unpopular policies such as this, perhaps focusing on inflation while unemployment might be a little high. Politicians would, of course, want unemployment to be low in order to get reelected. So that's oversimplifying it, but the bottom line is that the central banks are autonomous and independent for a reason. Here's a map of the 12 basic regions of the Federal Reserve in the United States. Let's just talk a few minutes about monetary policy, primarily what does the Federal Reserve do. One of its major tools is controlling interest rates. The discount rate is the primary rate that the Federal Reserve charges to its member banks, the national banks around the country, to get money from the Federal Reserve, and then that therefore then influences the prime rate that you would go to the bank in order to borrow money in order to buy a car or buy a house. So the lower the discount rate is, then since the other banks are competing with each other, then they would subsequently lower their prime rates in order to get your business of borrowing money. The federal funds rate is the rate that banks borrow against each other in order to maintain their reserve requirements on a daily basis. So if they've loaned out more than what their reserve requirement requires them to keep, then they would do overnight loans, and these are the federal fund rates that are between banks. But this interest rate is a very important tool, because if the economy is slowing down, or if it looks like we're going into a recession, one of the things that the Federal Reserve can do is lower interest rates, because then that makes money more attractive. That is going to stimulate the economy, in theory, that will motivate people to go out and borrow money because rates are low, and then they would use that money to perhaps buy big products such as cars and houses, or for businesses to borrow to build another wing onto their business to improve their productive capacity and hire more people. And then as the economy starts to overheat, which means inflation starts to creep back up, then they would raise interest rates, because that makes borrowing less attractive. So they're using that interest rate up and down to kind of regulate the economy. And that's a very hard decision to make. And we've seen just over the past decade that the Federal Reserve had been very hesitant in raising up interest rates as the economy started to improve. And administration was actually trying to prevent them from doing that. But then what we see, as we now are perhaps getting into another recession, the Federal Reserve literally needs that tool of an interest rate to be able to bring it back down in order to help the economy. So if the interest rate had not been brought back up during a healthy period, then it would not have that tool to lower that interest rate during a recession, which is what we might be facing right now. So that's why it's a very tricky, touchy operation that has to be done slowly, methodically, and carefully in order to use that tool. The reserve requirement ratio is just the amount of reserves that, of course, those are kept at the Federal Reserve. That's why it's called the Federal Reserve, because it has all the reserves of the entire banking system. And those reserves flow in and out in order to keep the banking system flush. And that's why the Federal Reserve, by charging interests on that, they return a very hefty profit back to the federal government. But the reserve requirement ratio would also be used to perhaps stimulate the economy. For example, if the reserve requirement ratio was set at 10%, which is what the banks had to keep on reserve, well, if the economy starts to slow down, or if we start getting into a recession, what they could do is lower that reserve requirement ratio to perhaps 8%, which means then the bank could then loan out more money in order to try to stimulate the economy, because their reserve requirement ratio is lower. So that's another tool they can use. And another tool that they used quite prolifically and are starting to use it again is buying and selling Treasury securities. These are bonds, notes, to where the Federal Reserve, particularly in a sluggish economy or during a recession, they would literally buy securities from the banks. So literally what they're doing is taking that security from that bank and then putting more reserves into that bank in return for those securities, putting more money into the banks in return for these securities in order to stimulate the economy, so that the banks will have more money to continue to loan out to people. And when the economy starts to overheat, inflation starts to come up, they want to slow things down, well, then what they will do will sell those securities back to the bank and take that money back out of the banks, take it out of circulation, so to speak, in order to try to slow down an overheating economy. And of course, those things are very difficult to do, because politically, nobody wants to do one of these measures that could potentially slow down or hinder a booming economy. So that's what makes their job very tricky, and politicians are always pushing back against them to do some of these things, but they have to have the flexibility to do these operations either way in order to try to regulate monetary policy. This is what is called open market operations, to where they're buying and selling these treasury bonds, these treasury securities. So that's what I wanted to talk about for part one, some basics of the economy, and then touch on monetary policy. So we'll pick up part two with fiscal policy and the techniques that the government uses for regulating the economy.